I don't know what it was they were putting back in the water in 97, 98, but it just seemed all of the biggest and best developers at the time were all trying to outdo each other by making the greatest first-person shooters of all time. It was around this time period we had games like GoldenEye 007, Quake 2, Half-Life, and of course Unreal, developed by none other than Epic Games. And I think you can really tell the age and demographic of someone by their association with these developers. For some people it's Fortnite, for others it's Gears of War, but for the true OGs it's Unreal, and then even before that with Jazz Jackrabbit and Jewel of the Jungle. It seems almost every gaming generation they left their mark in one way or another, and you just can't deny the impact they had on the shooter genre with the original Unreal. A game which, although being undeniably as good as its brethren, just somehow doesn't seem to get as much love and appreciation. Now, I'm kinda guilty of this myself to some extent, and it wasn't until I was mulling over some of my old crappy videos that I remembered this thing existed. So I thought it was maybe worth making a newer crappy video to talk about it again. Like all good shooters from that time period, Unreal doesn't bog the player down with needless cinematics or exposition. But the only thing you get is that opening demo flying across that iconic castle, which is really more of a glorified tech demo for the engine itself. Starting a new game, you're then thrust right into the action, playing as Prisoner 849, aboard the prison ship called the Vortex Rikers. Turns out the ship's crashed on the planet of Narpali and you're one of the few survivors. Being told bugger all about what's happened, but that's cool because you'll figure out the rest of that stuff along the way. In a neat spin that they don't even really make that much of a fuss over, you're actually playing as a woman. Something which isn't really relevant or has any bearing on the overall story. In fact, outside of a few grunts of pain when you take damage, and maybe catching your own reflection in a mirror, you probably wouldn't even know. But it is kinda unique and it separates her from her other testosterone-charged counterparts.
I've got balls of steel.
What follows is a pretty lengthy journey across Narpali as you then discover the planet's been attacked by a hostile alien race known as the Scar. Now, I have always pronounced this as Scarge with a J, but I have been told recently that apparently the J is silent. So as far as I know, the correct way to say it is Scar, and that's Scar with a capital S. Like your mum's a bitch with a capital B. Along with being just a massive bunch of intergalactic dicks, the Scar have also enslaved the Gnarly, the natives of the planet who look like a combination of Dhalsim from Street Fighter and the Mudokons from Abe's Odyssey. You actually see the Gnarly pretty frequently throughout the game, and they always somehow manage to get themselves in the firing line. Then becomes pretty obvious early on that your mission, above all else, is to liberate them. It still physically pains me when I see these poor guys getting killed, and if you're one of those people who would willingly shoot them just for shits and giggles, well, then you're dead to me. Gotta say though, it does kinda make sense how they got dominated so easily when you see just how much of a pushover they are. They're really pacifists in the complete sense. Though I would be pretty chilled out too, I suppose, if the entire female population of my species had an extra set of tits.
I wish I had more hands.
Part of what makes Unreal's campaign so enjoyable, I think, is that it really is seamless and perfectly paced. It always seems whenever things are starting to feel a bit repetitive, you always end up moving on to the next area, which often has an entirely different feel. You start off moving through small villages, underground caves and mines, but you'll also explore cliffside monasteries. There's churches, castles and dungeons, with the whole thing ending inside the Scar mothership, where you kill their queen and show that prehistoric bitch how we do things downtown.
This chick is toast!
The sound design also plays a pretty big part in making everything feel so immersive. Right from that opening level as you're trying to escape the prison ship, there's incidental background and ambient noises that you might not have even heard, but your brain did. Like the sounds of people screaming as they're killed by unseen assailants really informs you of this hostile nature of your surroundings. And also serves to explain why you don't really run into anyone else on the planet throughout your journey. At this point, humans are pretty low down on the food chain and you'll figure that out pretty damn quick. What you also might not notice is that there's a night and day cycle, and this kind of happens in the background without there really being that much attention drawn to it. As you first leave that prison ship, it's daytime, then after coming out of the mines, it's dusk, before later on, it's the dead of night. Then a few levels later, it's back to daytime. And it really just helps to reinforce that notion of this being an actual journey on a tangible world, instead of it just being one random level back to back after the other. You feel like time is progressing and the world is existing around you. Half-Life and Quake 2 were really the main competitors this thing had, or at least the ones that drew the main comparisons. But I do think Unreal just beats them in terms of the sheer scope of some of these environments. Although some of the areas are interior and more confined, these outside areas are truly massive, humongous even, humongous, giving you that sense of being isolated on this huge, desolate alien planet. People often compared Unreal to Crysis in terms of how good it looked, and though it does kind of sound funny to say that now in 2021, I think the game still definitely holds up when you run it at a high resolution with things like anti-aliasing and texture filtering. I mean, there's even a similar sequence in that Scarship at the end that's kind of similar to that final level in Crysis. It's a reminder that a decent art style, much like Marissa Tomei and Salma Hayek, is something that only gets better with age. There's something about the reflective surfaces too that just looks amazing, and the combination of the textures and the lighting effects just makes it look even better. I have no idea how they'd pull off these kind of visual effects, and there's definitely some clever shit going on at an engine level to bring this stuff to life. But again, man, that's just kind of proving my point of how creative level designers used to be, when they had these restrictions and boundaries they had to work within. And it almost kind of seems that with bigger and better engines that we've had in recent times, that it's made level designers a lot more complacent, because it seems like less effort has to go into making them look passable. There's even like a whole ecology thing going on here too. You've got alien creatures flying around, there's things swimming about in the water, and then the more docile creatures that I can only describe as alien bunny rabbits. Plants grow fruits you can eat to regain your health, and if a corpse is on the ground for too long, eventually you'll start to see flies buzzing around, which was also something they did in Quake 2. The soundtrack in this is also arguably, I think, one of the best of all time, at least as far as shooters go. I think a good soundtrack in a game is one that accompanies the action without taking too much of a focus away from it, and I think Unreal's music does just that. Right from the first track when you leave Rikers and start venturing out into Napali, the music just fits the whole tone perfectly. It's no wonder these guys would go on to compose the music for the rest of the series, and I think a lot of these tracks honestly wouldn't even seem out of place in a 2021 playlist. It's evocative, it's adaptive, and it's catchy, and it's got this great combination of ethnic and electro themes. The perfect balance of the sci-fi aspects with the organic and natural elements to the planet itself. In layman terms, it's good shit. Unreal also has some downright iconic and memorable moments in its level design. I can still remember encountering that first brute at the start of the game, which makes the whole thing go from 0 to 60 pretty damn quickly. The first time you encounter that lone Scar a little bit later is arguably one of the best moments in the entire game. You walk down this corridor only to have your way forward barricaded, and then all the lights start to go off one by one. Before this thing comes out of the goddamn walls, and right off the bat you start to notice it's not quite like any other enemy you've fought before, mostly because this thing fights almost like a real person. Yeah, one thing you'll notice here is the enemy AI. This AI isn't just intelligent for 1998 standards, it's intelligent by today's standards. At the time, Half-Life got a lot of praise for its AI, but I think the massive difference here is that this time the enemies in Unreal are way more reactionary. That is to say that they base their behaviour off what the player was doing, whereas I always felt in Half-Life that you tailor your strategy based off what the enemy was doing. If the Marines would retreat, for instance, you'd chase after them. If they throw a grenade at you, you'd run away from it, hopefully. They'd often seek out cover, so you'd have to hunt them down or flank them. With Unreal though, it feels like you're more in the saddle, and the enemies seem to behave more off what the player does. So, trying to shoot someone with a rocket launcher or the flak cannon from a distance, you'll see them actively dodge those incoming projectiles, putting them on the defense. But if you're going to play a bit more timid, well, they're going to punish you for it, being a lot more aggressive and attacking without reprieve. And it is almost kind of depressing how the AI peaked in a game like this way back in 1998, and this kind of thing still hasn't really become the norm even in 2021. The Halo series is the closest we've ever come to seeing this kind of reactionary AI replicated, and even then though, I don't think it was until about the second or third game when they even came close. In Unreal, it gets even tougher when you come up against these guys that are also armed with the same weapons as the player, and these feel more like mini death matches more than just random encounters. It's kind of a shame then that they really ruin it with the bigger, tougher Titan enemies. These are those absolute bullet sponges that you encounter maybe half a dozen times if not more throughout the game, that take an absurd amount of damage to put down. I'm talking all of your rockets, dozens and dozens of bullets, and enough firepower to wipe a third world country like Australia right off the goddamn map. To put it into perspective, the basic Scar enemies have about 170 health points, give or take. These guys have 18 fucking hundred. Getting hit by a projectile from one of those Scar will do anywhere from 10 to 20 damage, but then catching a boulder to the face from a Titan's gonna do 300. I've always kind of felt too that these guys just really ruin that back and forth nature of the rest of the combat. I mean, they're not that smart, they're just these big lumbering idiots. And the tactic to beat them really just consists of either moving left or right. Most of the time, if I can, I try to run right past them, but even 20 something years on, these guys aren't really the high points of the combat. But look, it's a minor quibble about the combat, and it's not really that huge in the grand scheme of things. And it's like complaining about a pimple on a Victoria's Secret model. Unreal still has some of the more skill-based shooting of its era, and the fact too that a lot of the weapons are projectile-based means that it's much more than just putting your crosshair on something and holding down the fire button. Compared again to Half-Life and Quake 2, which feature a lot of hit-scan weapons. And it's really interesting going back and replaying this, considering pretty much all of these weapons were used in every single Unreal game that came out after this in one way or another. These guns are like the Toyota Corollas of boomer shooter weapons. Effective, functional, and standing the test of time. You don't actually have a melee weapon, but you do have the Dispersion Pistol, which is a fallback weapon that never runs out of ammo. With the benefit though of it being able to be upgraded if you find power-ups throughout the game.
Power up.
With great power-ups comes great responsibility though, because the better the pistol is, the more damage it does, but also the more ammo it uses, making you wait for it to recharge over time.
Zap, you dumbass!
You do get an actual pistol as well, which fires bullets, making it one of the few hit-scanning weapons in the game, and also kinda super useful. Not to mention you can fire this thing like a gangster by holding it to the side with the alternate fire mode. The next weapon you're likely to find is the Stinger, which is like a combination of a nail gun and a shotgun. The primary fire shoots out rapid but also kinda slow projectiles, which can easily be dodged by some of the more nimble enemies. And then that alternate fire mode is like a whole burst of projectiles at once, resembling both the spread of a shotgun and your mum's legs. And there is something universally enjoyable about shooting someone in the face at point blank range with a burst of razor sharp darts. The fourth weapon is the shock rifle, which is again a pretty damn useful gun, kind of like a watered down railgun, and it has one of the best alternate fire modes of all time, where you can shoot out this little energy ball, and then if you can hit that with the primary fire, it explodes, doing massive damage. It's a high skill, high reward mechanic, not to mention it's the stuff that boners are made of when you pull off that combo successfully. The rocket launcher though is something that I'm still kind of on the fence about, called the 8-ball. With this thing you can hold down that fire button and then charge up to 8 rockets to fire off at once. Yeah, 8 rockets, that's what's referred to as a mega oof. If you manage to get your crosshair aimed onto a single enemy, you can even lock onto them and then fire out heat-seeking rockets. Now, as far as rocket launchers go, this bad boy is iconic, and again, conceptually, it's been in every single Unreal game ever since. But here in the first game, it's just a bit of a letdown. The projectiles move way too slowly, and the charge up time is super long to be all that effective. Not to mention the grenade alternate fire mode, to me, is about as useful as a wet fart in a paper bag. I also don't think that damage is high enough considering how much skill and time it takes to land a shot. And again, like the other projectile weapons, the enemies can often easily avoid it. And you know what? I think that Epic Games thought the same thing too, because in Unreal Tournament they reduced that load from 8 rockets to only 6, along with decreasing the load time. And then in Unreal Tournament 2003 they reduced it yet again to only 3 rockets. It just feels like something needed to be changed here. Either the load time should have been faster or the damage should have been higher to compensate for that extra time spent. Either way though, I've always thought that this weapon was a bit of a letdown.
Fuck you!
And that's a damn shame because the rocket launcher is really one of those staple weapons of a shooter, along with the shotgun that you kinda hope the developers are gonna nail. Up next though is one of my favourite weapons, and that's the flat cannon. And look, I don't care what anyone says, as far as I'm concerned, this thing is a shotgun. And you just can't deny that it certainly has all of the hallmarks. That being, firing out a pile of sharp, jagged steel that's best used at point blank range. I mean, the sound this thing makes alone is enough to get any red-blooded male hot under the collar. It's also got a really effective alternate fire mode, firing out an entire round that explodes on impact, in case you've got to hit one of those pesky Scar at a distance. It's just so grungy and industrial, feels like I'm carrying around a portable meat grinder. It's a great weapon that's aged like a fine wine, and I'll never get sick of that catharsis of jibbing someone at point blank range. The next few weapons are a little bit trickier to use though, and really only worth mentioning because of their creativity, as opposed to being outright useful. Firstly, you've got the Razor Jack, which shoots out razor blades that can cut an enemy's head clean off. And then you've got the Bio Rifle, which fires out Gamer Girl Discharge, which is able to melt everything it touches. They're both pretty cool weapons, which have again stayed in the lineup for the entire series, but another good example of the weakness you're going to see with these slower moving projectile based guns. I think the Bio Rifle is definitely pretty creative though, almost kind of like you're wearing a Ghostbusters Proton Pack, which makes it worth using alone.
This chick is toast!
But this thing is really tricky to use and almost always plays second fiddle to any of the other weapons in your arsenal. The last couple of weapons are definitely two of the most utilitarian guns in the entire game, and that's the Sniper Rifle and the Minigun. Now look, I shouldn't need to tell you why these guns are so good or also why they're so important, but I will anyway. It's because they're hit scanning weapons with a high damage output and a plentiful ammo supply. They're just two guns that you should really have in any self-respecting shooter, the old sniper and the minigun archetype. I really find the evolution of all of these weapons to be part of what makes them so interesting, and the way that Epic has brought them back and refined them throughout the years has ended up with these guns being some of the most resilient, I think, in the entire first-person shooter genre. And again, to make another comparison to Half-Life and Quake 2, that's also the case with those games and their weapons. I mean, things like the Nail Gun, the Super Shotgun, and the Lightning Gun are still in the Quake series to this day with Quake Champions. Half-Life went on to use almost the exact same lineup in Half-Life 2, with the Magnum, the Crossbow, and the RPG. It just swapped around the appearance of some of those other guns, but I mean, the shotgun was still a shotgun, the pistol was still a pistol, and the SMG was still an SMG. Now when it comes to the bad side of things, although that list is admittedly short, there are still a few issues with this game, despite it being a solid package on the whole. One of the main things I've always noticed is how the game is really slow when swapping out weapons, which makes it kinda clunky during the middle of combat. The double tap to dodge control option is one of the dumbest features in the game and has got me into trouble more often than it's got me out of it. I know it's more aimed at the multiplayer mode, but I just never found it that useful in the single player. So make sure to turn that shit off pronto. As great as the campaign mostly is, it also gets kinda lazy towards the end. I've always thought the last few levels just feel rushed. Most of the other levels take anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to finish, but some of these last ones can be finished in minutes, if not even less. One of them is literally just watching an explosion that lasts all of 15 seconds. After that, you've then got to move back through a pitch black area of a ship you just explored, because someone incorrectly thought that this would be a good idea. And then the final boss is a bit of an underwhelming fight against an enemy who kinda looks like Korax from Hexen and goes down just as easily. All of these games from that same time period also seem to have this same problem. By the end of Half-Life, for instance, when I was running around Zen, I'd honestly rather be plucking the hairs out of my asshole. And same thing with Quake 2, that last slog through the Strogg Palace just went on far too long for its own good. I also feel like there's not really any kind of escalation in challenge the more you get into the game. I feel like Unreal really throws everything it's got at you early on, but it never really changes things up all that much. The challenge you get from about a quarter ways into the game feels like the challenge right up until the end. Once the autopilot mode sets in, you're really just kinda coasting through, chilling out to that dope-ass soundtrack. But maybe that's kind of an inadvertent compliment to how well this campaign's been structured. But the dynasty that Unreal left is really what's made it so impressive. Unreal got a pretty similar treatment to Quake. It got an expansion pack, which is generally thought of as being pretty lackluster. Then there's the boring as batshit sequel, Unreal 2, which almost has nothing to do with the first game and is one of the most tedious shooters ever made. I mean, I'd rather shave my balls and watch the hair grow back in real time than play through this again. It completely changes the weapons, the characters, and the setting, though it does look pretty good, I guess, and has some good old-fashioned early 2000s boobs in it, so that is a plus.
I'll be right here if you have any further questions.
But again too, just kind of mirroring the vast difference between the sequels with Quake 1 and Quake 2. The other thing is that after the first game, the series started having much more of a focus on the multiplayer component, much to the detriment of the story mode. Unreal's bot match mode is almost kind of like a prototype for what the series would eventually turn into, using the same weapons and even some of the same maps. Deck 16, for instance, being one of my favourite deathmatch maps of all time, made its debut in Unreal, and it came back in some form in every single game afterwards, and they'd even used the same music track but just updated for each new entry. That AI that works so well in the single player mode unsurprisingly works well in the multiplayer mode. In fact, the bots here are likely to beat the absolute piss out of you. That's a good thing. Seeing bots have a sense of self-preservation as they'd run away to get health or armor pickups, or the way they'd prioritize using certain weapons, and again, not to sound like a broken record, but all very similar to the same thing happening in Quake 3. Unreal Tournament came out in 1999, Quake 3 came out in 1999. The only difference is that although they continued the Unreal franchise with Unreal Tournament 2003, 2004 and Unreal 3, Quake would instead go back to that single player focus with Quake 4 before finding its multiplayer footing again with Quake Champions. People have been talking about a Quake reboot using Crash from Quake 3 as a protagonist because it'd be cool to see a female lead in a shooter, and yeah, I agree. But how about just rebooting Unreal, which already has a female lead? Not to mention one who's a pretty badass bitch, pushing back an entire alien invasion and wiping out their queen in the process. Doesn't get more badass than that, does it? Makes your mum look like Shirley Temple in comparison.